Daniela Ellerbeck, the Constitutional Programs Manager at FW de Klerk Foundation, joined by my colleagues and Professor Anna-Mart van Wyk. So today we're going to be talking specifically about nuclear weapons. And Prof, perhaps you can introduce yourself to our viewers.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and hello to everyone. I'm Anna-Mart van Wyk, as you heard. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Johannesburg, but I'm actually a historian and what they call a nuclear historian. So I've been researching South Africa's nuclear history from about 2006, doing archival research, on various different topics that are related to South Africa's nuclear history. But I also do courses, and I teach courses in international conflict and in the global politics of arms control and disarmament.
Prof, perhaps you can elaborate on the current world context of nuclear weapons.
So the current world context in terms of who has nuclear weapons and who not, and what is happening in some states. So currently there are 9 nuclear armed states in the world. There are the original 5, which developed nuclear weapons before 1967, and they were allowed to keep those weapons under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So those, of course, are the United States. It was the Soviet Union, but the Russian Federation later took over that responsibility. And then there's the United Kingdom, France, and China. And then we have what we call the non-legal nuclear armed states. Those are the states. So any other state under the NPT are not allowed. Basically, if you're a signatory of the NPT, you are not allowed, to develop a nuclear weapon. But as we have seen since 1968, one of the first states that then, well, in 1974 already tested what they call a peaceful nuclear explosive was of course, India. And that kickstarted the South African program. So South Africa became the second non-NPT state to develop nuclear weapons. Of course, Israel never admitted that they have nuclear weapons. But, all indications are there that their nuclear weapons program already started in the early 1960s. And then, of course, there's Pakistan and North Korea. So the non-legal nuclear weapon states, if we can call them like that, then is India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. South Africa dismantled the nuclear weapons arsenal and then signed the NPT in 1991. But we can talk a little bit about South Africa's history later. Talking about the disarmament, there was also the Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, who all inherited Russian nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s. So of those 3 states, Ukraine became specifically a major proliferation concern because unlike Kazakhstan and Belarus, who relinquished the nuclear weapons they inherited back to Russia, Ukraine refused to do that. It first said, that they would relinquish their nuclear weapons, and then they came up with, with some new ideas. So at first it renounced nuclear weapons, but it quickly changed the track and then insisted that it was a rightful heir to part of the inherited Soviet nukes that they had on their territory. So Ukraine also then insisted on being deserving of equal treatment to Russia, the Russian Federation, to financial compensation, and also for security assurances, should it decide to go, the nuclear disarmament route. So that whole issue of the inherited nuclear weapons was quite a contentious issue between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And in some circles, there is agreement that this tension partially contributed to the current tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and then also the current conflict. So Ukraine is basically fighting for the existence amidst this regular ominous threats from the Russian Federation that the introduction of nuclear weapons into the current conflict cannot be discarded. So this has opened up new debates also within and beyond Ukraine of whether it was wise for Ukraine to actually disarm the inherited nuclear weapons. So if we look at other states that are very much in the spotlight at the moment in terms of developing nuclear weapons is Iran. Iran has moved beyond what is needed in terms of uranium enrichment and what is needed for civil purposes. And when we talk about civil purposes, we talk about, electricity generation, like South Africa is doing with the Koeberg nuclear power station, or producing things like radioisotopes for cancer radiation treatment. So Iran is beyond that. So Iran is very secretive about its nuclear program. There's widespread belief that Iran has, in actual fact, already developed nuclear weapons. And the other concern that we have geostrategically, of course, is that Saudi Arabia has said if Iran is going nuclear, they would also be going nuclear. So that would, of course, create a whole nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and would position Iran with nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia, and then Israel. So the whole Middle East, that's why it's been so difficult in that region, to establish a nuclear weapon-free zone, like we have done in Africa after South Africa disarmed, to develop something like that. And then a third concern, of course, is North Korea. It's now proven that its nuclear weapons are becoming smaller, the warheads, smaller, but much more powerful. Okay, and they're also developing the missile technology. And there is also indications of collaboration between Iran and North Korea. Because Iran is good with missile development. North Korea has mastered the nuclear weapons aspect of it. And so, yeah, I think there's an exchange of information between those two states in terms of North Korea is very much seeking an intercontinental ballistic missile that can reach the United States. And that, of course, raises concerns in Japan and in South Korea, neither of who have any American nuclear weapons anymore on their territory, but is under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. So, yeah, that's in a nutshell the current world context.
I noticed that you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war. So I just wanted to just get clarity from you. We all know that the Budapest Memorandum was signed between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty if they were to return, which they did, the nuclear weapons to Russia. Clearly, the outbreak of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a complete disregard for that memorandum. Hence, I just wanted to know, in your opinion, do you think that if Ukraine did relinquish the nuclear weapons, we'd have the war today?
Come back to Ukraine and the Budapest Memorandum. You're absolutely right. I did mention the fact that, where Ukraine initially said that they renounced nuclear weapons, they quickly changed tack. And the security and assurance was one of the demands that it had, to say, we are prepared, to disarm or relinquish these nuclear weapons, but then we need an assurance that our territorial integrity will be protected, because we are now an independent state. We are a democratic independent state. So, but what keeps us, if we relinquish these weapons, what keeps us, from another state attacking us? It is. So in that sense, both the United States and the Russian Federation then made security, assurances to Ukraine to say that they would protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which Russia, of course, now broke when they launched this, what they call special military operation against Ukraine, which is now escalated to a full-blown war. Even if they don't use the word war, Russia broke that agreement. And that is why there's much doubt in Ukraine, also with some of my colleagues that I talked to in Odessa. Many of them are now really sad about the fact that Ukraine relinquished the nuclear weapons, because now it was easy for Russia to break that promise and to relinquish, that assurance that it gave to Ukraine. On the other hand, it's also exactly the reason why the United States is pumping so much money and military equipment into Ukraine, because of that agreement that they would help Ukraine, protect its territorial integrity. The fact of the matter is, the United States cannot do it ad infinitum. There's going to be a time when it's going to become impossible for them to push so much money and equipment into Ukraine. I mean, even President Volodymyr Zelensky lamented in 2021 in an interview that it was a big mistake to disarm, and that there would have been no Russian invasion if Ukraine had nuclear weapons. Now, that is debatable, because I think the major reason why Russia invaded Ukraine again is because of, territorial disputes. I think that's a major reason. I don't think it was because of the fact that they relinquished nuclear weapons that actually belonged to to Russia. Kazakhstan and Belarus gave the weapons back to Russia. Ukraine did not do the same, exactly the same. The IAEA had to send people in, and many of those weapons were dismantled inside the property and the territory of Ukraine. Some were relinquished back to Russia, but the vast majority were actually dismantled or disarmed under the auspices of the IAEA. And that is why Ukraine also only signed the NPT later than the other two states who had inherited the Russian weapons. But I think the current war is very much about territorial disputes. But that can be a topic for another day. What I'm also seeing developing there is what I call Cold War 2.0. I think Russia, with all of the old Eastern Bloc, of Europe, what they call the Iron Curtain, with that has now fallen away with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The majority of those states have now become part of NATO. And Ukraine was also putting its name in the hat of becoming part of NATO. So Putin has used that as an excuse, for launching this special military operation in Ukraine. But yeah, I think it's about territory. I think it's about Russia wanting to re-establish itself as a geostrategic power, in that region.
Well, Prof, touching back on the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, if we see the Middle East arming itself extensively with Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with Israel, do you think that non-proliferation treaty is still a viable means of deterrence, or are we moving towards a world where MAD, M-A-D, the mutually assured destruction, is a better deterrent? What then would it take for the Middle East to see a Pelindaba situation like what we had in Africa, where Africa became a nuclear-free zone?
So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, if a state is a signatory of the treaty, they are not allowed to develop nuclear weapons. So all of the what I earlier called the non-legitimate nuclear armed states, none of them are signatories to the treaty. Not Israel, not Pakistan, not India, and also not North Korea. Now, North Korea is a very interesting one, because North Korea was a signatory of the NPT, but withdrew from the treaty in 2003, just like that. It's a scapegoat in the treaty that if a state feels that the treaty, does not apply to them anymore, they can just withdraw without any consequences whatsoever. So North Korea withdrew from the treaty in 2003, went on to develop their nukes, which they, the first test was in 2006. So Israel hasn't signed the treaty, and it's very ambiguous about its nuclear weapons program. And South Africa learned a lot from Israel in terms of ambiguity when we had our own program, kind of like subtly giving tips that, we might have a deterrent, a nuclear deterrent, but actually not admitting to it. Okay, so that's the first issue in terms of also creating a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. You cannot really create such a zone when one of those states is already a nuclear power. Okay, so that's the first complication there. In the case of Iran, and that is where we need to link it back to North Korea. So Iran has definitely been doing stuff, okay, that goes beyond just civil nuclear energy. But it's also very secretive about that, and it's also very ambiguous about that. But nothing keeps it, because of that loophole in the treaty, nothing keeps it from actually leaving that treaty when they're ready, okay, to test explode a nuclear weapon, or to actually launch it in an attack on somebody else. So legally, Iran is in a violation of the NPT because it's a signatory. But if it has been developing nuclear weapons, it's in violation of the treaty and can, just as North Korea, decide to withdraw from the treaty. Iran has, of course, maintained the whole time that, as a signatory of the treaty, they are keeping to their obligations under the treaty. They are allowing inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency into Iran. And that's an important thing to note when you talk about these treaties. Okay, so the watchdog for the NPT is the IAEA. Okay, so they're the organization who needs to make sure, that the NPT is not violated. So the NPT is just a treaty, but it needs a watchdog. But this is a watchdog without a lot of teeth. This watchdog, being the IAEA, can actually send inspectors And every state that opens up a civil nuclear reactor, a nuclear power station, or a research reactor, and is a signatory of the NPT, has to allow IAEA inspectors into their country, to come and inspect their facilities to ensure that they're not developing nuclear weapons. The problem is with Iran, and there's also an additional protocol that has been, introduced for Iran, but Iran has not been allowing IAEA inspectors to see all their facilities. So they do have a few secretive facilities, and that is the concern, that they've been using those facilities, for developing nuclear weapons. And I've been to Japan and I visited Hiroshima, and it's very much, part of the history of just what nuclear weapons can do to a state. If you compare the weapons that have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if you compare it to the kinds of weapons that were later developed by the United States and the Soviet Union, I mean, those were very small in comparison to the 50 megaton thermonuclear bomb that was tested by Russia. It would have obliterated the whole of Japan, and I think it's also in Japan's conscious. It is kind of like a forbidden weapon, because it's so part of what they had to suffer, as a nation.
Do you think that we've passed the point of international law, international agreements and treaties? And as I say, we've entered into a world where small pockets of quote unquote cold wars are going to be keeping nations checked through mutually assured destruction. Is that where we've moved to?
Right. So on the question of mutually assured destruction, I think after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, that concept kind of like, it was the hope that of everybody that concept would disappear. But then you still had countries that, that were great enemies. And so the deterrent factor of nuclear weapons is incredibly apparent in the situation of India versus Pakistan, for example. So when India exploded, they exploded a peaceful nuclear explosive in 1974. So let me quickly explain what that means. So it means that there was an American program that was called the Plowshares program, where they wanted to use nuclear energy, nuclear explosive energy, for mining or for, constructing deep harbors and that sort of thing. So the idea was if you can use a nuclear explosive for, civil purposes, then it's a peaceful nuclear explosive. But to go from a peaceful nuclear explosive, you also need the 95% enriched uranium, just as you need it for an offensive weapon, a nuclear bomb. So in 1998, India tested not a PNE anymore, but a thorough nuclear weapon in 1998. It conducted quite a few tests, and 2 weeks later, Pakistan tested. Because Pakistan felt threatened by India. As you know, there has always been this conflict around Kashmir, with both of these states laying claim to Kashmir. So India developed nuclear weapons as a deterrent against Pakistan and as maybe an offensive weapon against Pakistan, but also against China. So India, there has been a border dispute with China that has been on for decades, if not for centuries. But okay, India only became an independent state in 1947. So India developed a nuclear capability, firstly as a deterrent against China, who was already a nuclear weapon state by 1967. And then Pakistan felt threatened by the Indian PNE test of 1974, thinking that India is not going to stick to a PNE only. They're also going to go for, bigger nuclear weapons, and that's why Pakistan developed a nuclear capability. If we talk about mutually assured destruction in that context, you would remember or might have seen a few years ago, there was a period of great tension between India and Pakistan. So there was an hotel that was bombed in India, in Mumbai, and there were Pakistanis that took responsibility for that bombing. And that there were all these accusations flying between the two states. There was an Indian aircraft that went into Pakistani, airspace, and the same happened with the Pakistani aircraft. And the world came very, very close to a nuclear war between nuclear armed states, literally within the past 5 years. And there the deterrent factor played a role again. Mutually assured destruction is very much apparent if a conflict should take place between those two states. Because it brings us back to the bomb that was exploded in Hiroshima was a 15-kiloton bomb. Okay, so if you take 15,000 tons of TNT, you explode that, you get the explosive power of the 15-kiloton ton nuclear weapon. In 1959, the Soviet Union exploded a 50-megaton bomb, and with so much more, power that would have literally obliterated the power that would obliterate most of South Africa. Now, India and Pakistan have both developed nuclear weapons with a much greater, explosive power than what was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So yes, mutually assured destruction would have been a very, very real thing should those two countries decide to take one another on with their nuclear weapons. And then, of course, mutually assured destruction also has a wider impact on the rest of the world, because it's radiation that goes into the atmosphere. There's the radiation that falls not only on people inside India or Pakistan, it would also be spread, to other neighboring countries. So there's that thing. So mutually assured destruction, I think, in 2024 is not something that we should forget about.
Prof, a couple of questions from my side. The situation that gave rise to South Africa developing nuclear weapons.
Why South Africa wanted to develop nuclear weapons. After the 1974 Indian P&E test, South Africa was starting to get involved, on the border with Angola. 1975, South Africa wanted to develop a P&E already from the late 1960s. So 1970, South Africa mastered an indigenous process to enrich uranium. So they wanted to market that enriched uranium commercially and was looking for an international partner. In France and Germany and also Italy was interested, to export highly enriched uranium to other countries. South Africa is very rich in uranium, but low enriched uranium can be used for civil. So why would South Africa want to enrich uranium up to a high margin? So they were interested in the peaceful nuclear explosive option, to use it also for mining. Well, South Africa is a big mining country. So when they saw that India got away with it in 1974, they immediately thought, okay, so we can take our P&E to the next step, but we must still do it very, very strategically and very quietly and in secret. And so by 1975, South Africa, of course, started becoming involved in the border war with Angola. And that war that broke out would go all the way until 1989. It was also between 1974 and 1980, South Africa was very much isolated in the world. There was a mandatory arms embargo that came into place in 1977. And South Africa started to become very threatened by the impact or the influx of the Soviet Union into Africa. So apartheid government was very much anti-communist. So they felt threatened by the Soviet Union, also helping to train soldiers, I would call them soldiers, in neighboring countries and so on. And then, of course, there were the Cubans in Angola. The Cold War was very much ongoing in Southern Africa at the time. So you had the Cold War coming to Southern Africa, Cuba involved in Angola, Soviet Union training the Cubans, etc., etc. So you have to look at the bigger spectre of South Africa's history at the time. Apartheid government felt isolated. They felt threatened by what they called the communist influx into Southern Africa. And when they created or developed a nuclear test site in the Kalahari Desert in 1976, which was then discovered by a Russian satellite. Russia was most probably tipped off by a spy that they had in the South African Navy since 1962 by the name of Dieter Gerhard. So Dieter Gerhard was working in Pretoria at the time on special projects. He overheard that there was a nuclear test site that was being developed in the Kalahari Desert, not far from Appington. And he probably tipped off the Russians. So Russia then, in an unprecedented Cold War collaboration, tipped off the United States. And so the United States ambassador, take its small aircraft, flew over the site and confirmed that, hey, South Africa is busy building an underground nuclear test site. Why would they want to do something like that? And so in the end, South Africa wanted to test the P&E. So by 1976, they were on the eve of testing, but it would have been a cold test, which means it would not have contained nuclear material at that point. They just wanted to test the integrity of the device. And they were literally, it was on the eve of that test that the test site was then discovered. So Russia then tipped off the United States, as I said. So the next moment, Botha, who was South Africa's ambassador in the United States at the time, he wasn't the foreign minister at the time, not yet. I must just check my historic facts there. But he was marched into the office of the Secretary of State, and then presented, with photographs of this facility in the Kalahari, and said, well, Mr. Ambassador, what are you doing? And Pick relayed this to me during an informal dinner that a colleague and I had at his house, and he was kind of like, Mr. Ambassador, what on earth are you doing in the Kalahari? He claimed he was not aware that South Africa was already, building a P&E and wanted to test the P&E. And so here he was, and he had to answer, and here was the pictures, and clearly there was something happening there that was not supposed to happen. And he says his reaction to the Secretary of State was, well, Mr. Secretary, it's very dry in the Kalahari, so they are probably drilling for water. And he said he marched out of the office and of the secretary, and immediately got onto the phone to Prime Minister Foster, John Foster at the time, and said, what on earth are you doing? Are you crazy? By that point, the plan was still a P&E, but the war in Angola was escalating. And so by 1977, South Africa was fully engaged in a border war with Angola. Because Angola at that point was independent. It became independent from Portugal in 1974, but there's a civil war that broke out, and there was the MPLA was a communist government that was installed then in Angola. The same happened in Mozambique. And so they wanted to keep that, that influence from coming down into Southwest Africa at that point. And of course, there was also the South African People's Organization, which was a liberation movement like the ANC at the time. And they were sending trained cadres into Southwest Africa, obviously fighting, for the independence of Southwest Africa at the time. Then South Africa got slapped with an oil boycott. It got slapped with an arms embargo. Kalahari test site was found out. So all of this came together in 1977. It lost its seat on the IAEA's Board of Governors. And all of this came to this point in 77 where they felt, look, we need a deterrent. We have, this arms embargo is now forcing us to start creating our own weaponry. My PhD is about that in any case, about the 77 arms embargo, how South Africa circumvented that, to build up a conventional arms industry. But they felt that they needed another deterrent. So P.W. Botha was the defense minister at the time, but he became prime minister in 1978. And he then took a decision that South Africa should get a nuclear deterrent, not as an offensive weapon, but as something that could be used as a bargaining tool. In other words, there was a three-phase strategy. If the South African government at the time felt that felt so threatened and felt that they were going to be overwhelmed with an incursion into South Africa, they would first of all only, tip off the United States to say that, hey, we've got a nuclear bomb, and hoping that the United States would come to the rescue of South Africa. If that didn't work, they would go to phase 2, and phase 2 would be to threaten to actually test, a nuclear weapon in the Kalahari. And if that didn't work, they would actually do a demonstration test. So it was never used as an offensive weapon. That's the reason then in 78 why they went from, a P&E to a full-blown nuclear weapons program, which was developed between 78 and 1989 when the decision was made to, it was only, well, they say 6.5 bombs, the half meant there was enough fissile material, to make a seventh bomb by 1989.
I'm guessing they must have anticipated an offensive from communist forces at one point in time for them to even be concerned about it. How big were the bombs? We know that we now had 6.5 nuclear weapons, but how big were they? Were they tiny? Were they tinier than the ones dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima?
To come back to the South African, how big were the South African bombs? So the first device that we had was a really huge device in terms of size. It was massive in terms of size. So if you look at pictures and videos, of the Hiroshima bomb and the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, you will see that in size they were massive. So the South African devices, the first few devices, were actually what they call Hiroshima-type bombs. Okay. And now, not to make it too technical, but you also get different nuclear bombs. So even America started off with the one bomb, the one on Hiroshima was a uranium bomb. The one that was dropped on Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb. Okay, so you also get the different. And then they went on very quickly to what they call a thermonuclear bomb. So which is kind of like a booster device where they put stuff like tritium in to make this huge megaton explosion. The South African bombs were not that big. I mean, they were Hiroshima type, and it was mostly working on highly enriched uranium. However, during the 1980s, South Africa has also developed quite far, into missile technology. So by the end of the 1980s, they had mastered the, and some people would differ from me, but this is what my research has led me to. So the ones that were relinquished at the end of the 1980s were those Hiroshima-type bombs. Those were the ones that were in storage. But we had by that point already mastered what we call a smaller nuclear warhead, which you can put on the tip of a missile. So the one that they used in Hiroshima, you had a big aircraft, that dropped that. But the idea is always to get to your smaller nuclear warhead that you can put on a missile, and those missiles can fly various distances. It can be shot from an aircraft or a submarine or whatever. In the case of South Africa, by 1986, the Air Force had been identified as what they call the user, okay, of the South African capability. So it means that there was this program to develop missiles that could have been shot from either a Cheetah aircraft at that point, or a Buccaneer aircraft. So if South Africa, did get to the point where they actually married the two, the missile and the warhead, that is still very much up in the air, because all the documents pertaining to the program, most of it at least, were destroyed in what was called by some Operation Masada. So getting archival documents on the actual size of the arsenal and the warheads, and whether there was an operational missile with a nuclear warhead already at the end of the 80s, that is still very much debatable. We don't have clear, it just, all the research points to the fact that they had mastered the technology by the end. So when you talk about sizes of nuclear weapons, a very small nuclear warhead can also make a very big impact. There's also what we call tactical battlefield nukes. So those ones are very small, and which you can use in an operational way. For example, if the South Africans wanted to hit a specific Cuban regiment in Angola, they would use what they call a tactical nuclear warhead. So again, there's lots of debate around whether South Africa had a tactical nuclear warhead by the end of the 80s, which you can shoot with a cannon like the G5 or the G6. Lots of debate, lots of uncertainty around that, but quite a few things pointing to the fact that we did have that capability, or was close to acquiring that capability.
If we were talking about India and Pakistan coming on the verge of a hot war, what are the size of the current nuclear weapons in 2024?
Now, coming back to the size of the weapons in the world at the moment, okay, so that vastly differs. So all of the states that have nuclear arms have various types of nuclear weapons. So some of them would have, if you look at the Cold War, for example, I often visit the Smithsonian Museum, the Air and Space Museum, when I go to Washington, D.C., because right when you come into the foyer of that museum, there are 2 huge intercontinental ballistic missiles, standing in that foyer. The one is a Soviet one, an old Soviet one. The other one is an American one. On the Soviet one, there are 6 warheads on top of that missile. Each of those warheads are nuclear, were nuclear, okay? And on the American one, there were 3. So what would happen if they send an ICBM? The Soviets would hit 6 different American cities, all in one. Imagine you hit New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington. You would take out the economic hub of America. You would take out which is New York. You would take out, Washington. You would take out some of the cities that have huge military airports or, ships and stuff like that. So you cannot really say what the size is of, the various different nations. I can guarantee you that they're consistently upgrading that. Now, that comes back to the NPT and creates quite a conundrum in terms of the NPT. Because all the 5 states that are the legitimate nuclear states under the NPT, under Article 6 of the NPT, they are supposed, to gradually disarm. Okay. So there have been treaties like SALT, there have been the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, there have been withdrawal from this treaty. So you don't need 5,000 nuclear weapons to be able to obliterate another country anymore. You only need a handful to be able to cause a nuclear winter, to totally obliterate the agriculture of a country and all that sort of thing. But some states still believe in more is better. So there are a lot of deployed nuclear weapons still. But what concerns me is there was a kind of like a lull. After the fall of the Soviet Union, because of those treaties between the 2 countries, both those countries brought down, their arsenals. But that did not keep them from starting to modernize their arsenals. So they might have less, but both Russia and the United States, and now also the Ukraine and definitely France, not Ukraine, sorry, the UK and France are busy modernizing their arsenals. I can maybe quickly show you both the United States and Russia, what they are currently busy with in terms of, and that is what we call vertical nuclear proliferation. So you get horizontal proliferation and you've got vertical proliferation. And both the United States and Russia are engaging in vertical proliferation where they are modernizing their arsenals. So the weapons are becoming smaller, but it's much more modern, but with the capacity, to hit various cities at one point.
I'm assuming even if Russia now had to hit New York, Chicago, Washington, Nebraska, Hollywood, and wherever else they decide to hit, my concern is that these weapons now are so powerful that they would trigger a global winter around the globe. Because I would be quite interested in what the repercussions are of, some of these big bombs going off now, because a war between Russia and America is one thing, but now you're talking about it's not just affecting Russia and America anymore, it's going to affect us in Southern Africa in very real ways. And why and what are those ways?
So nuclear war would, you talk about the nuclear winter. It is because the size of that explosion would totally obliterate the sun and probably push us into, it depends on just how significant that war is. The fact of the matter is if they deploy just a few of the type of weapons that they have in either the United States and Russia currently, but even those in France and UK, they are a lot smaller, but they're still very, very powerful. That would probably put us back in an ice age.
And that means that we in South Africa would have no agriculture, we would starve to death. There would be no sun because of the amount of mega fires throw up. Just to bring it home for the South African youth, what a nuclear war looks like and how it would affect them.
Okay, how would a nuclear war in Europe affect us here in Southern Africa? Well, there's something that they call, acid rain, because nuclear explosions that are so big that it impacts on the atmosphere, and those particles, start with all the winds that go around the globe. All of those particles travel around the globe. And that would affect cloud systems, and the type of rain, the acid that would be in the air and the radioactive particles that would be in the air would result in what we call acid rain. So we would if there's such a big nuclear war going on, we won't have water to drink, fresh water to drink, because rain, of course, comes down on both, rivers and soil. So we won't have healthy food to eat. We won't have water to drink that are clean. All of us would basically taking in radioactive particles. And it depends on how many of that you take in. You can either become violently sick immediately, or it can take you a few years. But you're looking at cancer. You're looking at, children that are born with disabilities. You are talking about contaminated soil.
So, Prof, I mean, you're talking about a few. Define a few.
With the type of nuclear warheads that they have these days, it can take maybe 2 or 3, just, a couple, can cause huge implications and consequences. There's in 1979, South Africa was accused of testing a nuclear weapon near Prince Edward Island in collaboration with Israel. The evidence was very circumstantial, but one of the things that pointed to a nuclear explosion wasn't only the Vela satellite that picked it up, but they found traces of radioactive particles in the glands of sheep in New Zealand. And that was probably from the fallout, of that one very small device that was tested near Prince Edward Island. I think there's general consensus that it was a nuclear test. Who was responsible for that? I have my own theories that I won't share here because I need more evidence. So there's nobody took responsibility for that test, but circumstantial evidence points to the fact that it was a nuclear test. So I'm saying it's Prince Edward Island is just south of, a few thousand kilometers south of South Africa, and the winds took that particles all the way to New Zealand.
I mean, I'm looking at Google Maps now, and Prince Edward Islands and New Zealand are half a globe removed from each other. So
exactly.
And I mean, there's even that theory that the weapons, because of how strong they are now, would cause mega fires, and those mega fires, with the amount of soot that they would let up into the air, would lead to blocking out the sun for up to a decade. So not just the acid rain polluting the water, but the sun would be blocked out. So we would all starve to death, irrespective of where we are on the globe.
If I can just quickly highlight something for you. Look at this weapon that Russia said it would deploy in 2023. This weapon is called the Satan, the Satan II by Western analysts. It's a liquid-fueled missile. It has a range of 18,000 kilometers, and it can contain 10 targetable re-entry vehicles, each with a nuclear warhead. So it can hit 10 cities in the United States or in Europe and basically obliterate the entire Europe, just as one that Russia is now deploying. There's the newest one from the United States. It can be deployed on a nuclear submarine. And again, it can hit multiple, cities in Russia from one submarine with just one of these missiles.
It's so shocking to see that, as you mentioned, a single nuclear warhead like this can destroy such a large population. And it's entirely not necessary for countries to have hundreds of these piled up in their stockpile. But if they do have hundreds, then that would lead one to assume that it isn't very difficult to design, to produce a nuclear warhead. And so I want to touch on a very gray area in international law. Do you think, or what do you think the probability is of private mercenary groups getting hold of or designing or manufacturing nuclear warheads? Because we open the newspaper these days and we read not about Putin, but rather about the Wagner Group. And if that's the case, what would that mean for mutually assured destruction? Because how do you pinpoint culpability to a private mercenary group and not to a state in itself?
There has been nuclear warheads that have gone missing, from Ukraine. That did not quite add up to the inventory, and everybody has been wondering what happened to that. Look, of course, if you want to develop a nuclear weapon from scratch, you have to have the facility to do that, the equipment and the facilities. You have to be able to enrich your own uranium, unless you can buy uranium from another state, or plutonium and that sort of thing. And tritium for a booster device is not something that you're going to get on the open market. So it is difficult for non-state groups. If they want to use nuclear weapons, they would have to steal it at this point, because I don't think a non-state group would be able at this point in time to actually develop their own nuclear weapon.
do you think then that we need less nuclear warheads and less countries with nuclear arms at all, and rather fewer countries with arms, but more international pacts, collective self-defense treaties like NATO, where one protects the rest of the globe?
You see, that's of course what NATO is about, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So if one state within the NATO alliance gets attacked, by a nuclear weapon, say for argument's sake from Russia, the rest of the NATO countries, those armed with nuclear weapons, have the right to retaliate. So there is that mutually security assurance pact that are between the states.
Thank you for
Yes.
joining us on yet another episode of a Constitution at Work podcast. Today we were joined by Professor Anna-Mart van Wyk, a professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, we thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. I very much appreciate the opportunity.